by asking the audience a question. Have you experienced generational conflict or generational diversity in your offices? I mean, is this something that you see as real? The reason I'm asking is because when I first started talking about this 5-6 years ago, I felt as if I was talking about it from theory. Now I've really experienced it over the last 2 years. While I was at the graduate school USDA as a Gen Xer, I was experiencing it as sort of the innovator, the person who was trying to push the envelope on doing things a new and different way. Now I've had the opportunity at GovLoop. We have a staff of 10 people. 8 of them are millennials, including my boss. So I've had both a boss who's a millennial and people that report to me who are millennials. And I can tell you that generational diversity is real, and it creates all kinds of communication issues in the workplace. So I've experienced it. I'm assuming you have. So let's get into that topic today. What I'd like to do is just give you a quick overview of what we're going to do. I'm going to do some introductions. Each of our panelists are going to say a little bit about their perspectives generally on generational diversity in the workplace. And then I'll dig into some questions. We'll cover, hopefully, we'll have time to cover work styles, authority and leadership, communication, recognition and rewards, as well as learning. I have a bunch of questions. I could probably talk to these folks for 3 hours, but I want to stop at some point and have you ask questions, or if you just want to jump in, let's make this as interactive as possible. I think we're all comfortable with that. You see no slides. We're just going to go off the cuff and keep it real. So let me start with Ginny Hill. She is, ladies first.
Right? Of course, absolutely.
She is a program manager at NIH, National Institutes of Health, and she heads up their Presidential Management Fellows program. She was actually a Presidential Management Fellow herself. Also, she is the current president of Young Government Leaders. I've had an opportunity to work with her in a variety of contexts, including at the Next Generation of Government Training Summit. She's excellent, and so I just want to see, what's your perspective, Jenny, on generational diversity right now, and sort of the state of things that you're seeing in NIH?
Yeah, thanks, Andy. So I'm excited to be here because my perspective on generational diversity has kind of 2 parts. The first is in my role in Young Government Leaders. In YGL, one of the things we try to do is be the voice for young federal employees. We also have state and local employees and contractors. But for the most part, we really do try to speak on behalf of young feds. What are the issues that are facing us? And then in my role at the National Institutes of Health as the agency coordinator for the PMF program, I do a lot of work in recruiting millennials, although we're seeing more and more Gen Xers in the PMF finalist pool. But still, nonetheless, we look at recruitment issues, retention issues, and then how do we please them once they're here? So retention is such a key part of bringing in this new generation. And so we really look at how to keep people motivated, what training opportunities and what formats resonate with people, so that we can keep them specifically at NIH, but at the very least within public service. And that goes well with our YGL mission, which really is to keep people in public service and motivate those of us that have that public service mindset to stay. So that's really my perspective. And I think there's some unique things about this generation, but a lot of things that we have in common. A little self-disclosure, I'm like right on the cusp. I think they often say that like the early 80s is the cutoff for Gen Y. So I'm kind of somewhere on that cusp, born in 82. So I can see both sides, and I probably more identify with the millennial generation, just kind of looking at the characteristics of that generation. So I'm happy to speak a little bit from my own perspective as well, since I joined government about 6 years ago.
Thank you. That was a perfect segue, actually, Jenny, for me, because I was going to move to Jeffrey Vargas and have him give us the generational overviews. Who are we talking about when we talk about the 4 generations? But before he does that, let me tell you a little bit more about him. He is the Chief Learning Officer at U.S. Commodity Futures Trading Commission. I have a great bio here for him. It's long, which means he's done a lot of really interesting and great things. But he's put together the Commission's roadmap for learning through the deployment of a strategic learning plan. There's 700 CFTC employees that he's training. He's done a formal training needs assessment there, 40 in-house training sessions, 350 online financial market courses. I think he's doing some innovative stuff around virtual learning. Before that, he was 15 years at the Department of Energy. He's sort of the known generational diversity guru in government. He's making his mark, and I'm looking forward to the things he's going to be doing down the road. But Jeffrey, give us then the the overview, the 4 generations, the cutoff, so that people know where they stand. I'm sure we've all heard it before, but it's always good to get a reminder.
Well, first, thanks for the introduction. And you're going to be hearing from Sean. And Sean and I, you'll find out later, created a lot of generational differences training and did research together. So when everybody identifies me as a generations person, no way, it's Sean really. We should get the credit, so let me put that out there. But when we talk about the 4 generations, a couple of thoughts up front, and cut me off because you know I can talk too long about this. So give me the signal, third base coach,
140
or less. Right? We'll tweet it. You'll see a lot of researchers, and there's books that even take us out to 2060. What are the generations? Will they look like? And they started with the Puritans. So you can have all kinds of dialogue about when the cutoffs are, but we'll just stay with a standard if that's okay with everybody. So anyone born before 1945 would be considered part of the first generation, which is, they have 3 different names. We'll just call them one today. Call them the traditionalists. Also called the silent generation. There's others that are identified. But when we think of that generation, a couple of characteristics come right to mind. One, they're very linear and logical in their approach to problem solving. So they want to know there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. They also like to have fun. But they like to have fun after a project is completed. We'll find out later. Other generations like to have fun when a project's just got started, right? The other thing with the veterans is they're very fiscally conservative. And if you look at our GS system, it was built based on that mentality. You have to do, it's very linear logical, you have to do 1 year at the lower grade in order to progress to the next. It's developed in the 1940s under the thought and mentality of a veteran traditionalist mentality. They are roughly about 5 or less % of the federal government currently. Next are the baby boomers. Baby boom generation, often the generation that's ready to clap for themselves. Yay, baby boomers, right? Okay, 1946 to 1964, about 80 million strong. The predominant generation in the federal government. In fact, when Sean and I first started to do this dialogue almost 8 or 9 years ago, boomers were some 60% of the government. Even though they've retired, they're still 40% of the government. But we did a study we just did a study in June that looked at the SES. In 2008, 99% of the federal government was baby boom. In 2012, of SESers, 97.5% were baby boom. So to say that we are a baby boom identified government is absolutely the case. So what are some characteristics of baby boomers? Baby boomers believe that problems are solved by teams. The bigger the problem, the bigger the team. You got a big problem, get a bunch of folks together, put a blue ribbon panel together, and we will figure this out. Hope and optimism rules the day. So what is it we need to do? Well, if we get in a room together and we figure out who we know, we can make anything happen, because for boomers, failure is not an option, right? For Generation X, we're going to find out later, failure is failure. Boomers call it something different. Oftentimes, what's the terminology we use?
Lessons learned.
Lessons learned, right? Generation X goes, no, that was a failure. So you can start seeing where you can have some generational dialogue. Boomers also believe that growth and expansion identify success. So you can be in a room with a boomer, give them an idea, and they're saying, that's a good idea. But Andy, here's what we really should do. And the idea is going to morph into something bigger and greater. And so will the metrics that go along with it. And then comes Generation X, born 1965 to about 1979 or so.
Ooh.
Yeah, so you're right on there, 1979 or so. Generation X, also called the forgotten generation. Why? Because they were forgotten, mostly. And for Generation X, they believe that problems are solved by individuals and not teams. So the bigger the problem, the smaller the group you go to. You probably can notice some generational conflict that shows up in that case. Generation X also believes holistically that when you have an issue that pops up, you just address it head on. Generation X is very much about transparency. And the fact is that you want to be fair and uniform to everybody, but we have to be transparent. And you can actually work with people that you don't like. Wait a minute, that's not the same mentality for boomers. So for Generation X, results are what drives activity. For boomers, activity can be a result in and of itself that we should celebrate. So how does that play out? You have a Generation Xer who's leading a project, and he or she, and a boomer who's leading or even the same project, and a boomer will say, We held a conference. We held a conference in 2014. It took us 2 years to put together. Let's give each other high fives. The conference took place. And a Generation X person will say, so what did you do at the conference? What did you expect to do at the conference? How did you measure your success? The boomer will say, we had the conference. And the Xer says, that's an activity. Y'all with me on that, right? And then welcome them. Generation Y, yay, the most celebrated, cheered on generation possible. 16 different names, from the iPad generation to the coddle generation, right? Generation Y, also, we'll call them Generation Y for now. Generation Y, 80 million strong, without question the most educated generation of all. Generation Y also has fantastic interpersonal skills within their own cohort. Generation Y enjoys and 94% want to have meaningful, purposeful work out front. So what you will often hear from a Generation Y person, or not often, you could hear it once in a while, maybe the 6% that won't tell you, but is, I'm not sure if I want to work on that. I want to work on things that are meaningful for me. Probably hear that a lot in YGL. Mm-hmm. Not that the other generations don't want to work on meaningful things, but for Generation Y, they have been given a mantra that says they can do anything that they want to do. The challenge is we haven't given them the full conversation. We need a little add-on or run-on sentence. We need to add a comma that said, if you work hard and gain some experience. So what's happened is we've sold a bill of goods to Generation Y, identifying a readiness that may or may not be there. And then we have a different paradigm of leadership for them. What we've told Generation Y since they were coming up is, you're a leader. And Generation Y says, well, I know I'm a leader. Well, why am I a leader? Because I did everything you told me to do. Well, that's not just what a leader does. You know, a leader figures out problems that are not yet identified and starts working on them before they're told. This is new concepts for Generation Y. And Generation Y is exceptionally entrepreneurial, very bright, and wants to do good work. Gene Twinge, who's a researcher for them and wrote a book called Generation Me, Chapter 8 talks about Generation Y also has a lot of challenges when it comes to when things don't go their way, because their level of expectation and disappointment sort of looks like a yo-yo or an up and down roller coaster. So we have challenges in government because we absolutely need all four generations working together at the same time. Our challenge is we have a lack of generational awareness, and so we figure, you know what? One size fits all. And we're going to find a way to make it happen, and we're going to make it work. And by the way, a baby boomer's going to lead it. And all of a sudden, there's a little bit of shakeup that's taking place. Partnership for last two things I'll say. Partnership for public service, right? Did a study. I knew you. I felt it. I felt it. Did a study on high-performing GS-15s about ascending to the three-letter, a land of heaven called SES. And what the study said was a significant amount of 15s don't want to go there. Why? Because they would rather have a few less pennies and have better work-life balance. So where conceptually the ideas were, this is interesting, the reality is it's disrupting our leadership models that we've had in the past, and it's going to create some challenges in government that we aren't yet prepared for. I'll stop.
I couldn't have planned these segues any better because I wanted to talk about the leadership pipeline and I wanted Sean to address that. But let me introduce Sean. He is the Chief Human Capital Officer for the National Archives and Records Administration. He's been there, only since June. You're brand new there.
Yes, indeed.
Before that, he was at the Social Security Administration, did some great things there. But I think he and Jeffrey met during his time at Department of Energy, where he was a human capital specialist. Projects consisted of $2 million in improvements to the agency's strategic recruitment, social media strategy, career mapping, competency identification, and on and on. He's also just notably a co-founder of the Hispanic Youth Institute. Did that back in July of 2004. So authority on both generational and other forms of diversity in government. So I think that Gen Xers, Jeffrey, are not the only ones who are the forgotten generation. There's actually a boomer split that people neglect to talk about. Yeah. There are the older boomers who are the ones who are sort of cycling out of government right now. But there are these younger boomers, you might be one of them, who are sort of in their 40s, mid-40s, and they're saying, wait a second. Where's the leadership development for me? What happens to me? I want to be plugged in. I've been waiting a long time to get plugged into those leadership positions that are about to be vacated. So there's both younger boomers and Gen Xers who are being skipped over for then this development of Gen Y, millennials, whatever you want to call them. I resent that a little bit, right? And I think that there are some young boomers who do as well. And I'm a Gen Xer. So by the way, you have Gen Xer, Gen Xer, Gen Xer, Gen Y. So you got your target audience right here. So, Sean, talk a little bit about that phenomenon. The boomer split, the difference, succession planning.
Well, succession planning is probably the most challenging issue confronting government right now because at least what I've been able to experience, both where I am at now and at the Social Security Administration, is just the bench of talent that can essentially move forward. We do put a lot of focus on development at the ground floor and a lot of emphasis on trying to get folks to the top floor. But the medium in between floors are the ones that tend to struggle. We haven't necessarily built very strong learning strategies like Jeff has tried to do at the Commodities and Future Trade Commission about trying to address that middle. And then for me, it's also trying to keep everybody engaged in the work that they're doing because I see all four generations still at work. Jeff is right about the statistics and the shares, I guess, within an organization about it being about 3 to 5% traditional, 40% baby boomer, and then about, at least in the federal government, 40% baby boomer, and then Gen X is about another 40%, and then Gen Y is about another 18%. So what ends up happening is these folks are waiting to be listened to and heard, and to me becomes a employee engagement and listening session in a way of what are the needs of each of the different generations and how they go about doing their work and what types of modalities will we use when it comes to training, because it's not going to be a one-size-fits-all approach. I'm going to train and develop a veteran much differently than I'm going to train and develop a Generation Y, and how do we kind of map those different types of modalities, whether it's classroom, whether it's classroom versus virtual versus book learning versus community of practice. There's all kinds of different things that we've essentially tried. So at least I can speak at the National Archives. One of the things that we're trying to do is basically figure out what does the map really look like. One of the things that we haven't been able to do at National Archives, I'm just actually starting, I'd say this week really, is really focusing on career maps for our key mission critical positions. And we have a particular position called the archivist and archivist technician position. So it tends to be very history oriented, very focused on what happened in the past. In fact, if you go down to National Archives, you'll see the sign that's past is prologue. So there is a sense of wanting to protect the past, but then when you bring in Generation X and Generation Y that are very change ready, let's push the envelope, let's go to the next thing, and you're like, you hold up, wait a second. Let's not forget about all the stuff that we've done in the past. So sometimes in that hurrying to achieve, we forget about all the lessons that we have learned from being a veteran or the baby boomer. So those are having those discussions and being able to have talented individuals that can see through that generational lens and focus on bringing out that expertise when it's appropriate is probably the mix that we're trying to work on right now.
So let me dig into some of these different generational issues that can come up. Work styles is the first one. When I say the word work, what do you think of? Is it a place that you go? Is it a thing that you do? How you interpret that word matters, and it matters by generation. So just, Jenny, talk a little bit about how and where do members of, let's talk about Generation Y and then maybe some of your experience of Generation X, or some of these folks who are coming into government, in terms of how and where are they most productive. I don't want to talk about these generational issues as challenges. I think actually they all, each generation brings something to the workforce that becomes a force multiplier. So how do differing work styles create opportunities for productivity, and how then some of these differences, how do you see them maybe impacting the workforce in the next 4 to 5 years? Yeah.
So I'm going to state the obvious, which is that Generation Y wants flexibility. So that's really the key word when it comes to work style. I and a lot of my cohort believe that work can be done anywhere. I can do work in an airport, a Starbucks, in an office, at home. It doesn't really matter. A lot of the work that we do in government, we're not making widgets anymore. It doesn't matter if you work an 8-hour day, punch your clock, exactly on time and leave exactly on time. The work that we're doing is cognitive. It involves people skills. It involves quality, not necessarily quantity. So that's where there's some wiggle room then to provide flexibility, because if it's not necessarily about the quantity of work and I don't have to punch a clock, well, then I can be trusted to telework. I teleworked before coming to this meeting, so I didn't have to go into the office, show my face, do a quick cameo, and then come over here. It was my boss trusts me to kind of do a little bit of work, come to a meeting, and then come back when I'm done. So that flexibility, that autonomy, I think is very important. And again, we want to be sure that nobody abuses that flexibility. Just like any employee, there has to be accountability. But allowing for that trust and autonomy, I think, up front is something that really resonates with our generation. And then thinking, too, about what other flexibilities in the workplace might somebody want. And the government is doing a wonderful job with alternative work schedules and other kind of, NIH calls it max flex, where you can really work 80 hours anytime you want. And we're piloting that with a few offices. So if you want to do 5 hours on a Saturday because you have a commitment on Thursday, something like that, you can flex your schedule to do any 80, I think is another term that they use. So that's something that's really starting to catch on, and those pilots are taking off. And that's something that we really like for this generation, because that allows us autonomy, flexibility, and feeling the trust from our supervisors and our coworkers. So that's really something that I think is important. And just kind of the last note, I think that goes to a general theme of a lot of me and my coworkers, which is that it's not so much about working long, it's about working smart. So you can get the same amount of work done if you're working really hard. You can get that done in 6 hours, and take a longer lunch to meet with a coworker, make some connections, do some networking. So it's not so much about those hours. It's really about working hard, working smart, instead of saying, oh, I just worked a 12-hour day, and that's not my metric that I worked a 12-hour day. It's that I got something done. Back to Jeff's point about accomplishments, I think is really, really key.
So Jeffrey, this makes the boomers freak out, especially the older boomers. I think the younger boomers actually dig this type of environment. And so I'd actually call the younger boomers the Obama boomers. When I say that, what I mean is look at how President Obama got into office. I mean, he leveraged technology effectively and efficiently. I think actually there are a lot of younger boomers who do that. But so comfort the older boomers and actually make the case a little bit. One way that I make the case, and you can piggyback on this, is that if older boomers think about where they're going to be in 5 years, probably they don't have the income, the savings that they want to be able to retire completely. Probably going to double dip, as they call it, come back and do a little contracting. And they're not going to want to go into an office. Probably going to want to move somewhere near the grandkids and work from anywhere. So this is good for all of us, right?
So, first off, I so look forward to working alongside you in the future, because I'm totally down, and I will be your employee on a contract basis. Let's talk about that. No, I think what she outlined is exactly the workplace of the future. And I think what the challenge is, boomers grew up in a government that said you will be honored, you will be rewarded for your expertise. So work ethic and worth ethic were synonymous. And I'm an expert. How am I an expert? Because I get in earlier than everybody else, and I stay later than everybody else, and I'm more familiar with 5 CFR than anybody else, and I can quote to you the regulation. Well, that provides a level of expertise, but other generations look at it in a more holistic fashion. And it's not to discount that methodology of growth. It was what was available. And people did it. In fact, they took jobs they didn't want to go to cities they didn't particularly like to get grades that looked more like an apex and a pyramid that went up forward, right? It's a freeing moment, really, for boomers to say, you don't have to continue to do that. You really have done your time. And you can recognize that in that freeing moment, you get to make choices that are going to be best for you, just like the generation that you raised. You provided them that opportunity. It's sort of when the child becomes the teacher in some ways. Follow their lead and don't push up against it. Now, that is not the holistic answer, because as much as I agree with what she said, the one area where I think we have to have a more honest conversation with Generation Y is, well, actually, no, there are some things that you have to go through and you have to get mud on you for about 6 months or a year. There isn't a smarter way to do it, because, an example, if we're asking you to serve as a negotiator on behalf of the U.S. government for, let's say, Russia, You may know the language. You may have studied the history. You ain't sat around the table. You don't understand yet the body cues that someone's telling you absolutely no, but they're acting like this, right? So how would you know that? And yet we have you as a Foreign Service officer at the GS 13 or 14. You have wide responsibilities. We're actually doing a disservice by not having that opportunity. So the comfort for baby boomers is understand, study what the world of work looks like outside of the federal government, because we're a glass menagerie. Only the federal government, you'll find out once people retire, is that it's possible, it's likely that you may be working for somebody younger than you, who's more interested in your flexibility and your ability to work on a certain project than what you did 25 years ago. They understand that. They want you as part of the team. But that's not what gets you to have the legacy and the input and the opportunity that boomers want. And believe me, boomers still want to lead. In fact, if there's one thing that we know is boomers want to leave what we call even from the grave. So those are called legacy leads, right? I know I'm retiring this week, but we set the budget up for the next 5 years, and these are the metrics we expect to be accomplished. Can you see where a Generation Y person coming on board going, I need results now, may have some challenge with legacy leading?
Okay. Well,
Is there a question from the crowd? Or just a failed mute button?
Failed mute button.
All right.
Okay.
Well,
That's a
speaking of
Halloween
someone
one.
who's paid their dues, risen through the ranks, but did it quickly, that's Sean Clayton. You just got SCS recently?
Yeah,
The last year?
with my appointment, yes.
And
to,
so let's talk a little bit about authority and leadership.
Mhm.
Young guy, young SCSer, people, you walk into a room, I mean, you certainly look like you have stature, some experience. But,
Yes, he's definitely talking about my increased gray hair quotient for sure.
I mean, people are trying to color to keep their hair darker. I'm putting some gray in there.
That's right.
Now, seriously, so talk a little bit about authority and leadership and how the different generations look at that. Jeffrey touched on it, it's like time and seat, but I feel like government is and ought to become more projectized, which means you could have anybody with a particular skill set leading a team, people to accomplish something. Doesn't matter what it is. But that doesn't necessarily always work effectively based on differing views of authority and leadership. Talk a little bit about that phenomenon.
It really depends. For me, it really depends on the workforce. Having worked this is now my 4th agency, and I've been with the government for 12 years, definitely have seen a lot of different sort of cultures when it comes to organizations and how they do things, whether they're academic elites, because there's a lot of PhDs that do a lot of the work, whether it's a sort of customer service oriented, like Social Security. One of their mantras is we are the face of the government because of their footprint within the rest of the United States, or whether it's blue collar, like some of the things that we do at the National Archives and managing warehouses. There are still a lot of sort of blue-collar, wage-grade employee work that still goes on in the government in order to take care of a lot of those legacy things that haven't necessarily been taken care of because we're cutting services, we don't have funding to get to that upgraded, shiny new, and improved process. So what I've been able to experience is a little bit different, at least in my perspective. I call it, and there's actually now some research on this. There is a testing, I think, that goes on when you are a little bit younger and like, how did you get there? Or what is it that this person can teach me? What do you know? So I really had to change a lot from being focused on what do I know up here to being able to ask the right questions that will draw out the expertise that veterans and baby boomers want to show on display, and not necessarily dictate to them this is the way it's going to be, but partner with them in the process. So for my process with regard to that group is going to be very different when it comes to working with Generation X or Generation Y. It's going to be a little bit more laid back in certain ways, but also engaging, letting them know that there's this culture that we also have within the organization that, okay, you're going to talk up to Bob, Jim, or Jill, and they may be staunchly in a certain way, so we're going to have to approach this in a different way based on what it is that we're trying to accomplish. So the other thing that you'll get to experience, I guess, being younger and coming up into leadership is what I call almost a bullying in a way that will definitely take place. from people that haven't necessarily been there yet, thought it was their turn to be in the seat because they had been there the longest, and then somebody new from outside comes in, or somebody that is younger comes in, or even somebody that was their peer that might that they didn't think needed to be in that position because they had been in, say they've been working for state longer, even though they might not have had greater government experience. So those types of things I've experienced as well, and trying to prepare one's mindset for the backlash that will definitely come around, or being able to build trust with not only younger employees but older employees that felt like we have this hierarchy, we have this 1 year. I've been here for more 1 years than you have, so to speak, and to try and change the conversation from heartbeats in the organization to competency modeling, and what kind of skill set do we need to bring into this position is definitely a paradigm shift, at least for government, and to have those conversations more openly and frequently is probably the thing that I'm having the most fun doing right now.
My takeaway from that, if I were to put it in a nutshell, is really the younger generations then need to focus on being learners and leveragers, right? If I were to use a couple, alliteration there.
Sure.
Learn from that older generation and leverage then what they know to posture for themselves. But I would say that the older generations need to learn how to be coaches versus managers, right? So you need to take a different approach with this next generation. It's not sort of micromanaging as much as it's teaching them how to do that, how to learn from you, because that's really part of succession planning and knowledge transfer. You can't keep doing it. Boomers might be technically good at stuff because of their years doing it, but they need to transfer that knowledge because they can't walk out the door.
And teach them how to meet your expectations. So set that endpoint, set the result, the goal, the accomplishment. What does success look like? And then let them go through the process and coach them on the milestones along the way. And that really meets everybody's needs when you think about it, because the newer employee is learning, growing, having that autonomy, flexibility, and still meeting the boss's expectations. And if they don't, well, then there comes the coaching skills again.
And there is the coaching of, hey, this is how I did it. But don't say that's how you have to do it.
Right.
Say, hey, go ahead. I want you to accomplish this. Again, this is how I did it. But if you take a different path, I'm okay with that. In fact, then you might be able to innovate and come up with a more efficient way that could be replicated, right, across the organization. So, Jenny, sticking with you, just let's talk a little bit about generational differences in communication. Are you seeing any at NIH? Or maybe you can also draw upon your experience of YGL and how you communicate with peers versus how you're expected to communicate maybe in your agency, and if there's a difference.
Yeah, this one and the authority and leadership category were probably the most interesting to me when I was reflecting on some of the differences. What I've noticed is really that Gen Y has really prefers to default to an informal style. There's a certain level of formality at the get-go, but then the minute you show like a little bit of informality, collegiality, you give an inch, they'll take a mile. So what I mean by that, I'll give an example. I am of similar age, if not maybe a little younger than some of the fellows and interns that I supervise, and one of them, as we have gotten to know each other, he's been employed at NIH for about 6 months. Kind of lets loose with a little bit of curse language in a meeting with me, and I felt like I couldn't believe he crossed that boundary, but he sees that I'm trying to meet him halfway and notices maybe that I have a little bit more of an informal style, and then he kind of lets loose a little bit. So, and I've seen that time after time. I really started to notice it then, though, because it was just so in my face. And he was just saying it about something else, not at me or anything. But really, it was an interesting learning moment for me, because I thought, wow, I think people just thirst for that connection and that instant relationship. Think about where that comes from, right? So we're used to instant communication, texting, IMing. At NIH, we're using Link, which a lot of people probably are using. So I can instant message an executive officer in the SES, and I do all the time. My good friend Keith, to whom I'm the executive secretary for his advisory committee, so certainly junior to Keith, but Keith and I am at work all the time, using abbreviations and lowercase words and emoticons. So there's this new form of communication. It's not only instant, but it's informal. And so I think that just kind of gets ingrained in people's styles. And that can, I think, be pretty uncomfortable for somebody who's much more used to the formality, whether that be a baby boomer, a Gen Xer, or whatever, who has more of a mindset of the hierarchy and preserving that. So I think that Gen Y can get a little too comfortable in communication, a little too informal too quickly. And that can be one of the pitfalls that we just have to watch out for.
Jeffrey, what's the caution to, additional caution and how, for Gen Y, I guess, on that, but then also to help boomers and Gen Xers understand that and maybe coach a little bit, or just talk a little bit more on that dynamic.
Yeah, no, I think the excellent points were raised, which gives a very clear Gen Y perspective. I think part of the challenge is, boomers, their position and power are things that they worked exceptionally hard for and expect some level of honor to be associated with it. So when a Gen Y makes a decision to cross a boundary, just in general, without being invited to do it, it's probably a point of caution that we sort of put out there as a sort of universal possibility, because boomers are very wedded to their position. In fact, you're working with a boomer when he or she introduces themselves and say, hey, I'm John Doe, I'm Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for X, Y, and Z, and I've been here 25 years. They've just given you code on how to communicate with them, which is formal until I actually say, well, just call me Joe. At that point, it's formal. Another point I think was raised was that, which was really important, was that there was a yearning for connection. Well, boomers absolutely yearn for a connection. They want a connection. They want a connection to a team. They want to lead. They also have their sons and daughters believe in that too. So Gen Y yearns for a connection. Gen X does not. In fact, they're saying, why is this person asking me those questions? Gen X doesn't have a lot of vested interest in interpersonal skills to the extent that they want to go through all that. In fact, if there's a big problem, they're going to close the door and be by themselves to figure it out. So when we talk about communication and communication styles, a lot of baby boom leaders and Gen X leaders get into conflict up front because the Gen X style is, I might not even say hello. We're getting right to business. And then we'll say hello afterwards. Actually, sort of like we did today. I don't think I said hi to you, but hi. We did. Okay. I don't know if we did. I was trying to think about it. Right, we did a pound. So you get right to business, and then after it's all done, you may have that informal opportunity. Right. But Gen Y jumps to that. And so I would say the point of encouragement is we have to recognize preferred communication styles outside of our own, and don't ascribe and say that person is just being sort of a non-team player because they're exercising a style that we're not comfortable with. And as I think Sean's done very good and was able to escalate in his career, is he allowed himself the opportunity to engage somebody with the style that was comfortable for them, even though it may not be as comfortable for him. And I think every leader, if they do that, they're going to find more generational successes than they will challenges.
This is going to be my last question for now, and then I want to open it up, make it interactive, get your questions, what's on your mind. So it's going to be for Sean, obviously, as we're doing sort of the rotation here. I'm going to skip recognition and rewards and go to learning, because I am seeing we are at an incredible moment in learning in government. Conference scandals, trimmed budgets, people don't know what to do right now. I mean, I could probably name 15 indicators that training is changing before our very eyes. So how are you navigating that difference? Because it's hard to send people in person anymore because it's time out of office, it takes money, and then there's just the perception of going to conferences that it's fun versus serious learning that happens there. How are you navigating this very rocky period?
We're trying to bring everything back in the house to what we can, so it can be more agency specific. And it depends a whole lot on the organization. Our organization is a little unique in the way that we have a lot of student employees. In fact, 1 out of every 5 NOWR employees is a student employee. We have about 3,100 employees. So, and they're sprinkled, we have about 40 facilities all across the country. So that idea of portability, we can't bring all of them in to a certain site to training. So my chief learning officer, one of the things that he's really focused on are ways that we can leverage different types of training opportunities, whether it be web-based, whether it be podcasting, whether it be through bringing your own device to work and working with our CIO on what types of things we can do around that, and then leveraging a lot of the subject matter expertise that we have in the house for that knowledge transfer, which kind of plays on some of those generational strengths that we have. We know that veterans kind of like to tell stories. They like to tell the history of the organization and their place in the organization. Well, let's leverage that. And Jeff kind of keyed on this in some of his work. He had developed an in-teach program, essentially, on how to leverage current employees to become teachers and trainers rather than going out and buying something off the shelf that won't necessarily fit within the organization and speak to the organization's goals and projects and things of that nature. So kind of looking at that, trying to make training a little bit leaner, a little bit smarter, and when appropriate, develop some classroom training as well, because those interpersonal skills, to be able to build them, is going to be extremely important as well. I think, at least in our organization, you were mentioning at the top of this about being able to manage that middle, or give training opportunities and growth and development to that middle. So that middle is real for us at NARA, because we have managers and supervisors at the GS6 and the GS7, but not necessarily a lot of managerial training devoted to that group. So obviously we can have Generation Y at a 6 or a 7 be leading a whole group of individuals and not necessarily have given them a lot of the tools that would come with having seen a lot of different experiences within a federal career and things of that nature. So those are the types of things that we're really focused on right now, and trying to build that sort of, almost categories of training in a way to grow and develop that future generation, so that's going to be a little bit neater, leaner, swifter in the process.
I was just actually at National Archives last week. I was interviewing Richard Dine.
Okay, yeah.
Because I heard he'd been doing some interesting things. So they actually used NARA employees as actors and put together a security training. There were some issues with some of our national treasures or documents, and so they used employees to do the acting, to go through scenarios, and then created this very nifty video that I think has been used to train everybody from folks who are in the actual, I don't know what you call it, I guess the archives themselves, back rooms,
right,
to the people who are at the very front, sort of the security guards. So I thought it was a great example. I'm about to blog that interview, so look for some good
awesome.
PR.
I let Richard know.
And now you'll take it, right?
For sure.
So what's on your minds? Yeah, on the phone. What question?